get started? Or is somebody going to introduce me? I forget how we get going on this. All right, I just got the green flag. Well, my name's Tim Mousseau. I'm a professor of biological sciences at the University of South Carolina, and I'd like to thank the gang for inviting me to participate in this year's big event. And again, it really is a pleasure to be reaching out to all of you students from wherever you are out in cyberspace. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm a professor of biological sciences, and I started my career working on insects and fish and a number of other study organisms, and it really was just one of the reasons we do science is really for the fun. It's for the exploration, the discovery, and so a number of years ago, about 16, almost 17 years ago, I had a completely by accident chance to go visit the Chernobyl disaster area in Ukraine, and that has turned into one of my major research areas over the last few years. So today I'm going to hopefully share with you some of the more interesting parts of the work we've been doing, hopefully, and of course I am reading my little log here, so if you guys have questions or you want me to stop to do something, please feel free to interrupt me. I should also mention that I'm doing this from Berlin in Germany. I've just gotten back from the Ukraine. We've been working in Chernobyl the last couple of weeks, and I'm giving a couple of lectures here in Berlin on my way home early next week. So okay. So, the question that always comes up is, it's kind of an unusual thing to be doing, studying nuclear disaster sites. Why is it that you want to study Chernobyl and now Fukushima, now that we've had another major nuclear disaster? And of course, the answer really is that initially it was just because it was new and different, but now it's really about wanting to learn about the effects of radiation on natural systems. Turns out we don't really know a whole lot about the effects of radiation in natural systems, and I hadn't realized it was an open area, but it turns out there's lots remaining to do. So before we get into the results, let's talk a little bit about what radiation is. And some of you may have had physics, and some of you may have not. So we're going to do a little review here, and what I want to show you, if I can, is this little graph, and I guess I have the ability to highlight or something here. So anyway, what I wanted to show you was that radiation falls along this spectrum, electromagnetic radiation spectrum, all the way from really low frequencies down here, the frequency of actually, the wiring in your house, in fact, to TV and radio stations, to the microwave oven in your house. That's really electromagnetic radiation that's being zapped at your food to warm it up. Up into the optical range, where light is, and of course you've all heard of ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is really, sort of at the high end of the light spectrum. It has a little bit more energy, so it's a little bit more damaging to biological systems. And up here at the very far right, we have X-rays and gamma rays. This is this kind of electromagnetic radiation we call ionizing radiation because it has the ability to split up molecules. Water is the one that we're particularly interested in, but it has enough energy in this kind of radiation to change the chemistry, as it were, to make molecules more reactive. In fact, so it's much more potentially damaging. It can certainly directly damage DNA. All right, and the other thing to note here is that X-rays and gamma rays are basically the same thing. It's just gamma rays just have a little bit higher energy levels. All right. So, but when we're talking about nuclear radiation, we're really talking about three kinds of radiation. We're usually talking about alpha particles. These are basically the nuclei of helium atoms. So they actually have a lot of mass. And when they hit something, they can break it into pieces. But the flip side is because they have all this mass, they can be stopped relatively easily with even a sheet of paper. But if they get inside your body, this is a concern. Beta particles are essentially electrons that have been ejected from an atom. And these electrons, again, they have a fair bit of energy, but they also have some mass, and so they can do a fair bit of damage. But because they're a little lighter, they can actually penetrate a little further than the alpha particles, but they tend to do a little less damage because they're much less mass. And then we have gamma rays, which have, again, very high energy. They can penetrate through several feet of concrete, and actually, even an inch of lead only stops half of the gamma rays. And so these gamma rays can go anywhere. And but the flip side is because they're really just rays, they don't have any mass associated with them, and so the amount of damage that they can do is substantially less depending on the conditions. So that's our alpha, beta, and gamma rays. How does radiation affect biological systems? In particular, DNA is what we're really interested in, the genetic material, because that's what's passed from one generation to the next. And if it's damaged, then this can lead to all sorts of diseases that can be inherited from one generation to the next. So this is really potentially very important. And so radiation can hurt DNA, damage DNA in two possible ways at least. The first is directly. So if we have some sort of an alpha, beta, or gamma ray hitting the chromosomes, it can split the chromosomes into pieces. You can actually cut up single strands or double strands, and this, if it's not repaired, obviously will have a very significant impact on the cell's ability to replicate and serve its host. The other way that radiation affects living organisms and DNA really is more indirectly. And please tell me if my microphone volume is too high or something. If that's okay. It's too loud. I don't want to boom you out. But anyway, the second way, which is probably more important, really, is this indirect effect that results from the ionization of water molecules inside the cells. And this is why we call it ionizing radiation, because it has the power, the ability to create these chemical ions, which can then damage the DNA, can damage the DNA repair machinery, can damage cell membranes, can damage proteins. So it can lead to all sorts of different consequences for the living organism, which probably, like I said, mean that being the more important mechanism of DNA damage in the end. Right, next, where does radiation come from? Well, I sort of alluded to this earlier. Radiation is everywhere. It's all around us. And in fact, what a lot of people don't realize is that all of us actually get a fairly significant dose of radiation through the radon that comes out of the ground. This is natural radiation. It stems from the breakdown of natural uranium, and it just seeps into our houses. And in some parts of the U.S., it can be a really significant health hazard. In fact, I think there have been some suggestions that radon gas in houses is the second leading cause of lung cancer in people in the U.S. and China as well. And so no matter how you look at it, this natural radiation is very significant. Is a very significant health hazard, and so we need to know more about the effects of radiation, of course. And then there's all sorts of other sources of radiation, cosmic rays, and other kinds of external and internal sources. We all get a fairly significant dose of radiation each year from these natural sources. But more and more, actually, which is kind of interesting, again, people don't really appreciate it, medical sources of radiation are increasingly becoming a larger fraction of the dose we get from radiation. So X-rays if you break a bone or you go to the dentist. These are relatively small doses by themselves, but cumulatively over the lifetime of an individual, they can add up to a significant dose. And so you have to be thinking about the long-term consequences of external doses. There are CAT scans which are used increasingly to diagnose all sorts of potential problems, and again they have a fairly large dose associated with the nuclear medicine also, which is used for imaging and therapy. Again, I'm not saying that these are not beneficial. They are, of course. I would never recommend not partaking of the advantages of these medical advances, some of which that include the use of radiation. But one needs to, again, be aware that there are costs and benefits to all of these technologies. And so medical radiation is important. You all know, I'm sure, about the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan in the Second World War. Of course, this led to many hundreds of thousands of people getting a significant dose of radiation, and of course, there's been a lot of studies of these atomic bomb survivors. We've learned an awful lot about what radiation does to people through these studies. But those weren't the only atomic bombs to be exploded. As it turns out, there have been many atomic bombs exploded, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, and many of which were dropped into the South Pacific. For instance, this is the Bikini Atoll area in the South Pacific in the Marshall Islands, where the United States dropped many bombs, testing them during those years. And these bombs actually generated, actually look at this number over here, there were 1,200, almost 1,200 bombs blown up in the atmosphere, another 1,500 of them underground, 2,700 bombs tested so far in total, enormous quantities of radioactivity released to the environment and dispersed across the planet, in fact. And so, again, we really have limited understanding of the impacts, but in some parts of the world, the fallout from this atomic bomb testing is a significant source of radiation. And again, we need to know more about what the effects might be. This issue of nuclear terrorism has been raised many times in the last few years, ever since 9/11, of course, and it's really perceived as a very significant threat that some terrorist organization might develop a nuclear weapon. There have been many movies made about this. So far, luckily, this hasn't happened, but the possibility of something like a dirty bomb where radioactive materials dispersed using conventional explosives, these are serious issues, and again, we have very little idea of what the potential long-term impacts of this kind of an event might be for people or the environment. So we need to learn more. Another reason, excuse me, for needing to know more about radiation is the fact that we are a nuclear world. Right now across the planet, there are about 438 nuclear reactors in operation, generating electricity. This doesn't include all the experimental reactors or military reactors that are also in use. These are just the commercial nuclear reactors around the world. There's another 65 being constructed around the world right now, about 20 plus of them in China. And so nuclear is not going away. No matter what you feel, how you feel about nuclear energy, it's not going to disappear anytime soon. And in many parts of the world, it's actually growing significantly. And so we need to know more about the potential health and environmental impacts of this energy source. In fact, I live in Columbia, South Carolina, which is actually, I live within about 60 miles of 4 new nuclear reactors being built and a bunch of others that have already been in operation for a long time. And so where I live in South Carolina, we need to know more about the potential health and environmental concerns related to nuclear energy. One thing that I bet most of you didn't realize, but because I certainly didn't until a few years ago, every operating nuclear power plant releases large amounts of radioactivity into the environment just through its regular operations. It's totally legal. They have to. One of the byproducts of splitting atoms of uranium is the production of radioactive daughter products. This is the effluent that they generate. And the amount of effluent, this is just one example here from the National Academy of Sciences report showing the amounts of effluent. The total amounts of effluent have actually gone down significantly in the last 30 years, which is good. But there's still very large amounts. And the way that it's dealt with generally is simply to dilute it. So the solution to pollution is dilution, so say many. And certainly that's the approach for most industries of this sort. And so the radioactivity is simply dribbled out into the rivers or the lakes or into the atmosphere so that the absolute concentrations stay below regulatory limits. But don't forget that there's, again, large quantities released all the time. We don't really know what the potential environmental and health impacts are, but there are a lot of concerns and a lot of interest in addressing these questions. Unfortunately, many of the nuclear power plants in our country, in the U.S., are actually quite old, 30 to 40 years old, and many of them have started to break down and spring leaks. And this has been in the news a lot the last 5-6 years. It really started about 6 years ago, with the Vermont Yankee power plant, where they showed that radioactive water was leaking out of some of the cooling pipes that they really hadn't realized was going on until it reached rather high levels. And after this, they started measuring it at the other nuclear power plants around the country and realized that there were actually quite a few of them that were leaking. More than half of them were leaking unregulated, illegal amounts of extra radioactivity. And so again, this is the problem is that we really have very limited knowledge as to what that really means in terms of risks and hazards for humans and the environment. We need to know more. Just the last few weeks, this one has been in the news an awful lot. The Indian Point nuclear power plant just up the river from New York City, again, has been found to be leaking large amounts of this radioactive hydrogen in the form of water, and so there's a lot of concern, and the governor, I think, has suggested that they need to, somehow deal with this nuclear power plant. At least they certainly need to stop the leaks, because even though we don't really know how bad the risk is or how large the risk is, we know it's not good. That we can say for sure. And so there's a lot of concern. And then the last reason I was going to mention today, of course, is that another reason for knowing about radiation is that there are large accidents. There have been 3 catastrophic accidents in the history of nuclear energy, starting first with, depending on how you look at it, 3 or 4. I'm going to use 3, starting first with the accident at 3 Mile Island. There was a meltdown of the core of one of the reactors, releasing enormous quantities of radioactivity into the atmosphere. Because of the way that the measurements were taken, we actually don't know exactly how much radioactivity was released. And that first accident changed the way that we do a lot of business in this area, but we still need to know more. Then, of course, most of you, and the reason we're here today is that the Chernobyl disaster occurred April 26, 1986, almost 30 years ago. Major meltdown at this nuclear power plant, a nuclear fire that burned for 10 days, again, released humongous quantities of radioactivity into the atmosphere. The radioactivity was spread all across the northern hemisphere, but especially in parts of northern Europe, Scandinavia, and Central Europe, and of course, especially in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia. And again, just an area about half the size of Japan, which is a fairly large country actually, is significantly contaminated, remains contaminated today. In fact, people here in Germany, where I am today, apparently still cannot eat many of the wild boar that are hunted in the area because they are significantly contaminated still with Chernobyl cesium, radioactive cesium. So a major concern. And then, of course, finally, the Fukushima accident in Japan on March 11th, 2011, again, almost 5 years ago. Again, Fukushima, what Fukushima told us is that that nuclear accidents can happen even under, in the best of circumstances. People kind of thought that Chernobyl would be the last nuclear accident because, of the unique conditions of the former Soviet Union and that very poor reactor design. But when the accident occurred at Fukushima in Japan, everybody realized that accidents can happen anywhere. It's very difficult to predict. And in fact, there's been a recent publication, recent analysis of accidents at nuclear power plants. And it's really clear that we're likely to have another large-scale disaster sometime in the next 20 to 50 years, depending on how you look at it. So we need to know more about the consequences. So that's why we should be studying the effects of radiation in the field. As I mentioned earlier, we got started in 2000. I started working with my partner, Pape Møller, who lives in France. And we started working in Chernobyl, just looking at the birds and the bees, as it were. But we've also started working in Fukushima in July of 2011. We're mostly interested in the natural populations of organisms, although we've done a little bit of work with children. I'm not going to talk about it today. Been to Chernobyl many, many times. I think I'm up to perhaps close to 40 now. As I said earlier, I just got back from visiting Chernobyl for 2 weeks. I'll share some of our results with you, in fact, today. Been to Japan many times. We've published lots of scientific papers about our findings. And this really is critical. It's important that if you're a scientist, it's not really real until you actually analyze the data and present it as a publication. It's really only then that you can start to have some impact. All right. So what do we do as scientists? Well, I'm sure your teachers have told you the way science moves forward is through testing hypotheses. We pose questions about how the world works, and we develop hypotheses associated with these questions, and we go test those hypotheses, usually using experiments if we can, or using observational kind of data if that's the best we can do. And in our case, the sorts of questions that we've tackled, but tried to tackle, are very straightforward, very simple. Do low and high doses of radiation lead to genetic mutations in natural populations? That's really what it's all about, for the most part, at least. Do those genetic mutations matter in any way? Do they lead to problems for the organisms? Are there fitness consequences? And because I'm an evolutionary biologist, we're really quite interested in whether or not there are adaptations to this novel environmental stress of radiation. So we need to know if there are effects on survival or reproduction. Does it influence susceptibility to disease? That kind of thing. And does this end up having an effect on the population sizes? And of course, the reason we're here today, does this affect biodiversity, in fact, in these different populations? So let's get started. Sorry for the long introduction, but we'll get through the rest a little quicker. So first and foremost, is animal abundance and diversity affected by radiation? Pretty straightforward question, you'd think, and yet, when we were first really working in this area a little more than 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, there were people who were saying that the Chernobyl area was this wildlife haven, that there were animals everywhere, and it was a great place to sort of like a safari. And we were shocked by some of these TV shows and newspaper reports because, when we go to Chernobyl, we rarely see many animals. We might see a couple of deer, and occasionally, I think I've seen a moose 3 or 4 times. You know, occasionally some wild boar, some pigs, wild pigs, and you know, rabbits occasionally, and squirrel or two, but nothing like a wildlife haven. And so we went looking for the source of these suggestions that it's a wildlife haven. We realized that they really, you know, it was really sort of these anecdotal reports, mostly from reporters, but sometimes from other scientists. You know, here's an animal that was introduced to the zone, the Przewalski's horses, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. They're handsome beasts, very photogenic, and they will come to the road. They're used to being fed, and so people do see these horses fairly regularly. But it doesn't mean that the radiation is not having an effect. Occasionally, you'll see, you know, these are wild pigs, wild boar running across the road, and you see the little babies. And this happens to be in a very clean part of the zone. And that's another point I'm going to bring up a little later. And that is, when you do science, you really want to test these questions, these hypotheses. And so we are, you know, doing our best to do this work in a way that addresses the question of whether or not radiation is having an effect. What we noticed over and over again is that when you do see some of these wild animals, they tend to be in the areas of the Chernobyl zone that are relatively clean, that have relatively little contamination. And so some of these photos that have appeared in magazines, again, no scientific you know, study associated with them, just pretty photos of the occasional interesting animal that shows up in front of the camera. And that's all great, but it doesn't address the scientific question, the one that we're really interested in. Does radiation have an effect? And so we decided to do this as best we could as scientists. And the way we've done it is kind of unique, and it's really the only way that you can get at some of these kinds of questions, given that we really don't know exactly what was there before these disasters. You know, disasters, by definition, are unexpected and unpredictable, and so you never have the amount of information that you'd like from before the disaster to compare to after the disaster. So you have to come up with clever ways to get at this. And the way we've done it is by taking an approach that uses what we call biotic inventories at many different locations scattered across these different environments. In the case of Chernobyl, we've been looking at about 300 locations in both Ukraine and in Belarus that are contaminated and relatively clean. We also have control populations in other parts of Europe. But you know, again, looking at the numbers of organisms at 300 different locations. In Japan, we've extended it a little bit further. Here's a map showing the general locations of our areas, 400 different locations, and we've been going back to these places for several years. In the case of Japan, 4 years in a row, and you can see that these little squiggly lines here basically show where we've been working, and the areas that are in green or yellow are relatively clean, and the areas that are, you know, red are very, very radioactive. So we have both highly radioactive and highly relatively clean in our studies, and then and you know, in some of these places we go catch the animals, like this little I think this is a nightingale in the net, and there's the cooling, one of the old cooling reactors over here from the Chernobyl power plant. And here's me trying to pull a bird out of the net. These nets are really the most efficient way to catch these birds, but they do get their little claws stuck in the netting, and it can be a challenge to retrieve them. But it is great fun, and one of the reasons it's great fun is because you get to really handle it up close and personal, as it were, with some of these really interesting animals. I wanted to show you this video of a wryneck. It's a really, really cool little bird. It's a snake knight. It lives in holes in trees, and it pretends it's a snake, I guess, to scare off potential predators. And so and some of the birds, we also put little miniature dosimeters. This is a tiny little dosimeter that measures the radiation, and we put them on the birds, and then we catch the birds a month or two or a year later. And this, again, tells us how much radiation they're getting. We started working with small rodents, mice and voles in particular. And in the beginning, we were putting these dosimeters in little collars around them. Aren't they cute? But they are, now we actually have a much better method where we actually surgically implant them under the skin so they actually don't bother the animal at all. They didn't really like these collars very much, so, but they did work in terms of giving us data. Anyway, then so we go to all these different places, in Fukushima and Chernobyl, 400 in Fukushima, 300 in Chernobyl, repeated visits to these different areas. And then we look at, for every animal in that spot, all the birds, all the insects, spiders that we can see, and we build this massively replicated biotic inventory for across the landscape. Then we also measure all the other environmental factors that are likely influencing whether or not a bird or an insect is in that place. The weather, whether there's water, what kind of soil there is, what the vegetation is like, all of these kinds of things that influence distribution and abundance of organisms. And then we add radiation levels to our analysis, and we use some geographic information science approaches and some fancy multivariate statistics. And this allows us to generate models to predict what the effects of radiation have been in these different areas. And it's really the only way to get at this. And when you do this, the results are just overwhelming. First, and I wanted to show you what it really looks like, how this is done. It's really very simple. It doesn't actually take too much time, and I also want you to pay attention to any sound. So this is what it really looks like. A couple of biologists with their binoculars listening and looking for all the birds that they can see, and counting the butterflies and dragonflies and everything else. And very nice day in Japan. This is a relatively clean area, and you hear the birds singing in the background. It's pretty typical. All right, that's what it's like. Back to slides. Let's see. So using this simple approach, again, we've done a bunch of studies, written a bunch of scientific publications on this question for Chernobyl, and more recently for Fukushima. Actually written, I think, 7 or 8 papers in total for Fukushima birds, and a bunch more for Chernobyl. 5, I guess, for Fukushima in the last year or so. So this really is the record of the science that we've done, these publications. If something is reported and there is not a genuine scientific paper associated with it, then it's not real. Just because it's in Popular Science or in some other magazine doesn't make it real. It needs to be, again, validated and supported in this methodical scientific way. Anyway, the first thing we noticed in Chernobyl was that there were many, many fewer birds in these areas of high radiation here. About 1/3 as many birds on average in these areas of high radiation. A very, very strong effect in Chernobyl, 15 to 20 years after the disaster. Big effect on the biodiversity as well. About half as many species as there should be in these areas of high contamination. Again, very strong, significant impact on biodiversity of the birds in these areas. So what about Japan? And so we started going to Japan just a few months after the disaster there in July 2011, and we went there for 4 years in a row and counted all the birds at a wide range of different radiation levels, and we were really floored. We were really, really surprised at how strong the signal was. If you look at this graph, again, down here at the high radiation levels, very, very few birds, relatively speaking, for all of these different sites in this high range. If you go down to, the normal background radiation levels, many, many, many birds. So very, very strong effect on the abundance of birds, especially after 4 years. And again, a similarly strong effect on the biodiversity. Very, very low likelihood of seeing more than 1 or 2 species in the areas of high radiation, whereas in the clean areas up here, you can sometimes see as many as 10 species at a given point. So again, very, very strong impact of the radiation also in Fukushima. So what does this tell us? So we've got the radiation also in Fukushima. So what does this tell us? So we've got big effects on the biodiversity in birds in Chernobyl, and we're seeing basically the same thing happening in Fukushima. What this tells us is that it's more than likely, it really has to be the radiation that's causing this effect, because there's no other explanation for why you would see the same pattern in these two very different places. And this is really one of the hallmarks of the scientific method. We call this replication, being able to replicate the experiment more than once and get the same basic results every time you repeat it. And this as terrible as the accident, the catastrophe has been in Japan, it's provided this very valuable opportunity to conduct rigorous science to get at these questions. So a little bit of good coming from this very, very bad situation. And I wanted to, again, play you the video of what it looks and sounds like in one of these really contaminated areas. Most of these videos are available on YouTube if you want to watch them again. But listen carefully. What do you hear? A little bit of wind. It's absolutely silent. Not absolutely. There's the occasional bird that comes through, but very few birds, very few butterflies, and so it really is stark in the contrast. These two areas are really only separated by 10 miles or so, but they're separated by a very large difference in background radiation, and so. And again, it's reflected in the numbers of organisms. It's kind of a silent summer going on there. I don't think I'm going to bore you with this particular result. This particular paper that was just published a couple months ago represents kind of a landmark study in that we collaborated with a group of physicists in France who specialize in radiological dose reconstruction, and we applied these methods to our bird studies. And the basic outcome was that using this standard method for health physics surveys, what we discovered was that, again, most of the birds here in Fukushima are exposed to radiation levels that would be expected to have impacts on their reproduction in one way or another. And this is probably what accounts for, of course, the drop-off in the birds. They're just not living as long and they're not reproducing as well. So important study in that regard. And I'll just skip ahead a little bit about. Now, of course, everybody says, well, birds are one thing, but what about the mammals? We're a mammal. We care mostly about mammals. So what's going on with the mammals? And so we've actually done a number of studies to look at mammal abundances, large and small. The first approach we took, it's a little bit hard to do, especially with global warming, but when there's fresh snow on the ground, some of you who live up in the north there know what I'm talking about. When there's fresh snow, you can see all the footprints in the snow for a while. Now the problem is if the snow is there for a long time and there's no fresh snow, then you have many days of animals and people walking through. But if it's fresh snow, 1 or 2 days, you can actually get a pretty good idea of how many animals there are in a given area just by counting the tracks. And this is what we did. And can anybody tell me what this footprint is likely to be? Any ideas? Don't all of you put up your hands all at once. Anyway, it's probably a wolf or a wolf-dog hybrid. There are lots and lots of dogs in the zone, and there are a few wolves, and of course wolves and dogs are very closely related, and they can hybridize. So we don't actually know exactly what it is, but it's some kind of large canid. And anyway, when we count all of these footprints in the snow, what we find is that for everything except wolves, there's a very strong negative relationship with many fewer mammals, these large mammals in the more radioactive areas. Again, no big surprise, but nobody had really documented. Oh, thanks, Mrs. K. You got it. So we've also done a lot of work trapping the smaller mammals, the rodents. Isn't this guy cute? These are voles. They're sort of a small mouse, and they live in Europe, and they're really quite pleasant to work with. They don't bite, and they don't object too much to being handled. And so we've done some trapping for them to see how many there are, and again, found that there are many fewer in the more radioactive areas. Again, showing some big effect on of the radiation on reproduction in this case, and as well as longevity. This graph right here, this is from last week. Last week we were out catching rodents in Chernobyl, and it doesn't have any labels on it because it's not published yet. So this is unofficial data, but I just wanted to show you. It was so exciting to us to go there and spend all this time in cold weather, putting out traps and walking around in the radioactivity. Not necessarily the most fun activity, and but again, the results were worth it because here we go again. This is a completely independent assessment. Big drops in numbers in the more radioactive areas relative to the clean areas. More recently, we've been trying to look at the large mammals in both Chernobyl and Fukushima using these camera traps. Great way to really document mammal numbers. And we'll get to the people in a second. Yeah, these camera traps are great because they capture these animals. They're motion-activated cameras, and so when an animal walks by, it sets off the camera, records the image. And here's an organism that's endemic to Japan, only found in Japan. It's called a Sinervo. In Japanese, they call it a goat antelope. It sort of looks like a cross between a goat and an antelope. But in the wild, you never see them because they're rather secretive and shy. But putting out these camera traps, we realized there's actually quite a few of them. Here's another critter. This is anybody guess? What's this? What's this one? And it's your typical. Yeah, this is probably a hybrid between a domestic pig and a wild boar. It could be a feral pig as well. There's sort of a mix of both in the area. Lots and lots of these pigs around. And then here we have a cute little Japanese fox. Again, so these cameras are just fabulous. Oh, the other thing that Japan has that you don't get too many places, they have monkeys, these Japanese macaques that are there. They're just fabulous to play with. They usually walk around in family groups and very playful, especially the young ones, just jumping around and pestering the parents. Really, really quite cool to see them out there in the wild. Camera traps are really the only way that you get to see them behaving almost naturally. Oh, and look at this. We're in Fukushima, in the center of this radioactive disaster, and the Google car is cruising around and getting imagery for their maps. Never seen one in Chernobyl, but I guess we'll have good pictures of the roadside of central Fukushima. All right, everybody wants me to get to some other questions, so let me just finish off this segment with this results from Japan, showing again that there are effects of latitude, as you might expect. Further north, there are fewer animals. Further, there are effects of longitude, further away from the ocean. Sometimes will lead to fewer animals. Elevation, again, high altitudes tend to be colder and fewer animals. But the biggest effect right here is the effect of radiation. There are many fewer animals in the areas of high radioactivity. So again, this all sort of comes through. So let me start by taking a few questions. Let's see. We've got so how are people from Fukushima in the long-term study? Yeah, so that's a really big question. Actually, I'm at a conference here in Berlin where that's one of the main topics. What's been reported for the last few years is an increased rate in thyroid cancers. One of the radioactive materials that was released during the disaster in big quantities was radioactive iodine. And because iodine is a micronutrient and it tends to be concentrated in the thyroid glands, and if there's radioactive thyroid iodine, it gets concentrated in the thyroid, especially in younger children, and this leads to a very high dose to that particular tissue, and so thyroid cancer sometimes is really kind of diagnostic of this kind of radiation exposure. And what's been seen in Japan now is what appears to be a dramatic increase in the rates of these thyroid cancers. And really the only way to explain it is that it's the result of all of this radioactive iodine that was released during the disaster. It's not, of course, nothing is ever that simple because, of course, following the disaster, they knew that there was likely to be a pulse in thyroid cancer because of previous studies of the disaster in Chernobyl. And so they actually put a lot of effort into screening and monitoring the children of Fukushima. And so there's some worry that perhaps some of the results are the result of increased screening intensity. So we don't really know for sure just yet. We'll know in another few years for sure just how much of a pulse in cancer rates are the result of the disaster. Let's see, another question from Quakertown. Is there a recent biotic inventory for the 3 Mile Island area? That's a really good question. And, I don't, there was actually a couple of papers recently published from surveys that were conducted, in the 1980s. They had never been published before, and so I think there's a lot of data collected at the time that was never actually put into the primary scientific literature and used to test some of these ideas. They took measurements of the radioactivity, some measurements, but not nearly enough. And they did some inventories, particularly in the aquatic systems, in the river and streams. And so I think there's still much we could learn from the 3 Mile Island event that just hadn't been uncovered at that point. And let's see. Well, we can continue a little bit. I did want to. I wanted to talk about the horses, right? So the Przewalski's horses that were introduced into Chernobyl, really, really interesting animal. This is there are other names for it, the Mongolian horse. This is really the horse that was it was the wild progenitor to the domestic horse. Domestic horses are derived from this ancient horse, and it almost went extinct. It actually did go extinct in the wild, but all of Przewalski's horses. I know it's spelt like it should be Przewalski's horse, but it's actually Przewalski's horse. It's a Polish name, and so all of these horses were actually that are currently around are derived from the descendants of 9 horses that were in zoos in 1945, and somebody got the bright idea in 1998 to put 21 of these horses into the Chernobyl zone. Superficially, the habitat looks perfect for them. It's nice grassy steppe area, and they have multiplied a little bit, and you can get up close to them. They're handsome beasts. They really are. They have some really interesting behavior, and I really enjoyed getting close to them. But a couple years ago, we decided to see how are their numbers doing. Are they increasing in numbers? Or decreasing? And so we decided to do some surveys. And one of the ways that we can actually get at finding the horses, that they hide in the forest behind the trees, but they always give themselves away, and they do it because the males, the stallions, mark their territories with these giant piles of poop, and you can actually tell, how many horses are in a given area by the size of this pile of poop. It's really kind of funny, but it gives us a valuable insight into the numbers. But let me just show you a little bit about what we're doing. Although I got another question here from Quakertown. It's a good question. In a world that needs alternative power, what's your opinion of the molten salt reactors that use all of the fuel and can even run on radioactive waste? Yeah, so here's the problem. We don't have such a device. We don't have such a reactor, and it will take 20 years or more to actually to develop such a reactor, even if somebody was willing to pay for it, which nobody seems to be willing to make that kind of investment. One of the challenges right now is that the costs of development of this technology are absolutely humongous. The costs of insuring against the impacts of disaster are, again, huge. The economic impacts to Ukraine and Belarus as a result of the Chernobyl disaster, I think have been estimated at minimally $400 billion. It's likely to be, in the trillions of dollars in terms of the effect of the Fukushima disaster. And so there seems to be some unwillingness to invest in the newer, safer kinds of nuclear technology. Although there has been some movement on what they call the small modular reactor designs, which again have this kind of fail-safe cooling system whereby if the power goes out, the coolant actually freezes everything in place and keeps things from going critical. And so there's definitely some potential there. There's also thorium-based reactors. Thorium is another naturally radioactive element like uranium, but cannot be used for nuclear bombs. It doesn't generate material that can be turned into weapons, and so it's another technology that's shown some promise and some development in India primarily, where there are massive deposits of thorium along the beaches. But in general, that one of the issues is the general public has some serious concerns about the overall safety and certainly the costs of nuclear energy in the current mix of energy possibilities. But like I said before, we're at a global scale. We're building 65 new nuclear power plants right now. There's 4 of them being constructed in my state alone or on the border. And so, we're not going to escape from nuclear power for quite some time. Let's see. Let's just move on. So I mentioned that doing science is supposed to be fun, and even though we're in this radioactive wasteland, I still try to have some fun. And we've decided to employ drones to to do some surveying of the mammals. It's very, very useful technology. I've had a couple of drones now there. This is one of the newer ones that can carry different kinds of cameras. And just first show you the first video using the regular camera, and just to show you what the horses look like moving around. They're not actually bothered that much by the camera, and if you pester them, they'll disappear off into the woods. But they're not too bothered, and they are kind of tame, really. But what we've done this year, though, that is really novel, and it's going to let us get at not just the horses, but at many of the other large mammals in the area, is now we're using this infrared technology. Isn't this cool? And so this is basically the same video scene, except shot using a new infrared camera. And it allows you to pick out the mammals from the background very, very easily. So we're running surveys across the landscape and attempting to count all of the other kinds of mammals in the area. Let's see. Let's go back here. I guess we got 6 more minutes. If there are, more questions, feel free to throw them at me, and I'll just try to wrap up here. Oh yeah. So here's our first results from the horses. Basically, these little blue flags you see here represent the poop piles, and then the numbers represent the actual numbers of horses that were sighted in different locations. And based on this analysis, it looks like there's about 60 to 70 horses, although it turns out some of these horses think they're domestic horses. At least some of the female Przewalski's horses are attracted to the domestic stallions, and so some of them will disappear. They'll escape from Chernobyl in search of domestic male stallions, the rare male attraction, I guess. But anyway, handsome beasts, but it looks like there's about 60 plus or minus, and it's been fairly steady at about that number for the last few years. But in any case, the short story here is that Chernobyl and probably Fukushima, definitely not a wildlife haven, at least not in the way that some of these stories would present it. Certainly, some of the animals have higher densities inside the zone of Chernobyl because there's no hunting. The hunters are not there knocking them off. But the radiation, that doesn't mean that the radiation is not having an effect. And basically all of the studies we've done that have attempted to disentangle the effects of human direct effects from the radiation effects show very clearly that the radiation effects are quite significant. So we do need to do more. So it turns out I think I'm just about out of time, right? And so let me just I just had these slides in case we had time to talk about some of the other kinds of things that we see, including tumors and cataracts and genetic damage and a wide variety of things. And I invite you to go to my website if you're interested in this topic. I just wanted to end with this one last paper that was just published this last week, and it really gets at this question of how well are the animals doing. And it's basically an analysis of all the studies that have been conducted, and it basically what we found is that there's absolutely no evidence that the organisms are actually evolving adaptations to the radiation, and there's a lot of reasons why that makes sense. Part of which is that radiation has always been with us, and so we're always doing our best to repair the damage from radiation because it's always been there. The radiation from these accidents is just adding to all of the other mutagenic stress in our environment. And so it's not surprising that they really can't do much about it. But again, yeah, please do go visit my website or drop me an email if you have any other questions. And let me just end by briefly acknowledging all of the other people, of course, that have had something to do with this research in one way or another. This kind of research requires significant investment by lots of individuals in many countries, as it turns out. And I'm extremely grateful to the opportunity to have been able to do it. And the website is, let's see, how do I do this? Let's see if I can do this. Yes. The website is cricket.bio.sc.edu. And of course, if you just Google my name, you'll get it pretty quickly. Yeah. Let's see. I guess is that again. I guess I'm not in a huge rush, so feel free to, if there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. All right. Well, hey, you've been a great audience. Thanks so much for signing up, and really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Be on the lookout for there'll be an Animal Planet episode on Chernobyl coming up, I'm told, and so you'll get to see me up close and personal in that, I hope. And, all right. I guess. Yeah, well, I'll try to. Thanks for the comments, and I'll do my best to enjoy Berlin. The first time here, so should be interesting. That's the other benefit of doing science. You get to travel. All right. I guess.